Carlos Mendes, pushing 40 but with eyes that had seen far too much for his years, navigated the bustling Miami port with practiced nonchalance. Every line etched around his sharp gaze told a story of countless stakeouts, tense interrogations, and the quiet vigilance that had defined his career as a DEA agent. He was a man carved from dedication, his commitment to the job eclipsing almost everything else, leaving a subtle, almost imperceptible weariness in its wake. There were no grand pronouncements of heroism in his life, just the grim satisfaction of small victories against an ever-growing tide. Lately, that tide was rising dangerously fast, especially from the sea. Cartels, always innovating, were now exploring audacious new methods to evade detection, pushing the boundaries of technology and discretion. The Caribbean and the Gulf had become a sprawling, liquid chessboard for traffickers, and the latest intel pointed to a truly unprecedented move: a covert submarine operation. It was precisely this escalating threat that had brought Carlos to this humid dockside, once again placing himself on the knife edge of peril. The operation, codenamed Depth Charge, targeted the elusive Mako cartel, notorious for their ghost-like efficiency and their recent pivot to submersible transport. Intelligence had been scarce, gleaned from a handful of intercepted communications and a few unlucky, now silent informants. What they knew was terrifying. The Mako cartel was running a bespoke, homemade submarine, crude in design but shockingly effective, capable of slipping past naval patrols undetected. This wasn't some repurposed military vessel. It was a Frankenstein of steel and diesel built in some forgotten coastal workshop. The DEA's plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. Carlos, with his extensive undercover experience and uncanny ability to blend, was to be the sole infiltrator. He'd spent weeks cultivating the persona of Marco, a disillusioned ex-Marine engineer with a knack for diesel engines and a desperate need for quick cash. His objective: embed himself within the crew, gather intel on the Mako's operations, and crucially, plant a homing beacon once the submarine was underway. The agency would then track the vessel, intercept it, and dismantle the operation. Simple on paper, terrifying in practice. The rendezvous point was a derelict fishing dock miles south of any official presence, shrouded by mangroves. Carlos, as Marco, arrived in a beat-up pickup, his nerves a tight knot beneath his carefully cultivated facade of world-weary indifference. Two hulking figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured, their hands hovering near concealed weapons. They frisked him with brutal efficiency, their eyes like chips of obsidian, searching for any flicker of deceit. "Marco, huh?" one grunted, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Heard you're good with engines, hope you're better with secrets." Carlos met his gaze, a slight knowing smile playing on his lips. Only the ones that pay. He felt the tension radiating from them, a palpable suspicion that hung in the humid air like a physical presence. Each casual gesture, every measured word, was a tightrope walk over an abyss. He was one wrong move, one misplaced glance, away from having his cover blown and his life extinguished in this forgotten corner of the coast. He offered a cigarette, a small gesture of camaraderie that was met with a dismissive grunt. Blending in wouldn't be easy. These men were coiled springs of paranoia. They led him deeper into the mangroves where the air grew thick with the smell of salt and diesel. Then he saw it. Not a sleek military-grade vessel, but a monstrous, rust-streaked tube of welded steel, squatting low in the brackish water like a prehistoric beast. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a submarine, cobbled together from repurposed oil drums and salvaged engine parts, crude and menacing. Jagged welds crisscrossed its hull, testament to its improvised construction. The entrance was a narrow, circular hatch, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Inside, the air was already heavy and metallic, the space shockingly confined. Exposed pipes snaked along the curved walls, and rudimentary gauges glowed faintly in the dim light of bare bulbs. There was no room to stand upright, only to crouch or crawl. Every surface was cold, hard metal, reeking of oil and the promise of impending claustrophobia. Carlos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. This was less a vessel and more a coffin designed for one purpose: to carry its illicit cargo and its occupants into the silent, crushing depths. The danger was palpable, a constant hum in the oppressive quiet. The air inside the sub grew thick with the smell of sweat and fear as the crew began the final preparations. Four other men, all heavily armed and radiating a coiled menace, moved with practiced efficiency. They were a motley group, their faces hard and unreadable, their eyes constantly scanning even each other. Carlos, feigning interest in a pressure gauge, subtly observed them, cataloging their positions, their weapons. He noted the heavy plastic-wrapped bales of cocaine being carefully stacked in a designated compartment, the true purpose of this steel coffin. The captain, a gaunt man with a nervous twitch and a revolver tucked into his waistband, barked orders. "Pressure check, valves closed, let's get this pig in the water." The thrum of the engine vibrated through the hull, a deep, unsettling growl. Carlos's hand instinctively brushed against the small, cold rectangle of the homing beacon hidden in his boot. This was his last chance, before the ocean swallowed them whole. But with every crew member within arm's reach and their suspicious gazes frequently sweeping over him, the opportunity simply wasn't there. He had to wait. The hatch clanged shut, plunging them into near darkness, save for the weak glow of the dashboard. A deep lurch signaled the start of their descent. The sounds of the world above faded, replaced by the groan of stressed metal and the slosh of ballast tanks filling. The submarine settled into a rhythmic hum, a low vibration that became the sole companion in the increasing silence. Outside, the light quickly dwindled, giving way to the inky blackness of the deep, a profound isolation that pressed in from every angle. It was unsettling, yet also strangely exhilarating. Carlos felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He was in, deep behind enemy lines, literally. The hardest part, the infiltration, was complete. Now the real work began. He ran a mental checklist, assessing the layout of the cramped cabin, noting the subtle hierarchy among the crew, even the faint scent of stale cigarettes and fear. His senses were on high alert, his mind racing through scenarios for deploying the beacon. The Mako cartel thought they were untouchable in their submersible fortress. They were wrong. He had beaten them to their own game for now. The submarine continued its steady descent, carrying them further into the silent, crushing embrace of the ocean. The rhythmic thrum of the engine, which had become a perverse lullaby, suddenly stuttered. A harsh, grinding shriek tore through the hull, followed by an abrupt, sickening lurch that threw everyone off balance. The dim lights flickered violently, then died, plunging the cramped interior into absolute darkness, broken only by the frantic shouts of the crew. Carlos braced himself against a bulkhead as the vessel pitched and groaned, a symphony of tortured metal. A high-pitched, insistent alarm began to wail, cutting through the rising panic. He could hear the captain cursing, frantic clicks of switches, and the desperate thud of fists against unresponsive panels. A heavy clang echoed from somewhere below, followed by the terrifying sound of rushing water, a gurgling, sucking noise that grew louder by the second. They weren't just experiencing a malfunction, something critical had failed. The submarine bucked once more, violently, and then settled with an ominous thud against an unseen obstacle. The thrumming ceased entirely. The only sound now was the insistent alarm and the relentless, chilling rush of the ocean. They were trapped. The immediate aftermath was a cacophony of fear. Shouts, curses, and the frantic scrabbling of hands against metal filled the oppressive darkness. "What was that? We hit something," one man screamed, his voice thin with terror. Another began to sob openly. The captain, his usual twitch amplified, fumbled for a flashlight, its weak beam finally cutting through the gloom to reveal terrified, desperate faces. Water was indeed seeping in, a steady trickle from a seam near the stern, though not yet a torrent. Carlos forced himself to breathe deeply to keep his expression neutral. Internally, his mind raced, grappling with the impossible. Trapped. Underwater, with armed men who would kill him without a second thought if they suspected his true identity. His mission, the homing beacon, felt utterly irrelevant now. Survival was the only objective. He moved towards the leak, affecting a concerned engineer's frown, feigning expertise. "Pressure's dropping fast, Captain. We need to assess the damage." His voice, though calm, was barely audible over the rising tide of panic and the ominous drip-drip-drip of the ocean asserting its dominance. The flashlight beam found a pressure gauge, its needle quivering precariously in the red. Carlos's gut twisted. The air was already growing stale, heavy with the collective exhalations of 5 panicked men in a sealed metal tube. Each gasp, each strained breath was a consumption of their finite supply. He mentally calculated, roughly 24 hours for a crew of 5 in a vessel this size under ideal conditions. These were far from ideal. The captain was hyperventilating, and the 2 men sobbing were consuming oxygen at an alarming rate. The very act of living was now a countdown. Every word spoken, every frantic movement chipped away at their remaining time. Carlos could feel the subtle pressure of the dwindling air, a growing lethargy that fought against his need for sharp focus. He needed to manage this, to somehow slow the inevitable. But how do you tell desperate men to breathe less, to conserve what little life support they had left, without exposing himself or triggering a deeper panic? The oxygen clock had begun its relentless, silent tick, turning the trapped submarine into a tomb with a rapidly shrinking deadline. Carlos's mind wrestled with a brutal paradox. Every instinct screamed at him to take charge, to use his training, his problem-solving skills to find a way out. He was an agent of the law, a man sworn to protect. Yet the lives he was now trying to save were those of criminals, men who dealt in death and despair. Revealing his identity would instantly make him their enemy, likely resulting in a swift, brutal execution. But maintaining his cover meant silently observing their ineptitude, allowing them to fumble towards a shared grave. The conflict tore at him. His duty was to bring these men to justice, not to be their reluctant savior. But what kind of justice was a slow, agonizing death in the dark? The oxygen depletion was a great equalizer, stripping away titles and allegiances. He was just another man trapped, desperate for air. The homing beacon, once his sole focus, now seemed a distant, cruel joke. How could he signal for help when he couldn't even breathe? His mission had shifted from infiltration to agonizing self-preservation, intertwined with the fates of his adversaries. He was Carlos Mendes' DEA, but in this steel tomb he was just Marco, a trapped engineer. The cartel crew, stripped of their bravado by the encroaching doom, began to unravel. The captain, once a figure of terse authority, was now a trembling wreck, barking contradictory orders and slapping at unresponsive controls. One of the hulking figures from the dock, a man named Rico, began to snarl at the sobbing crewman, blaming him for some perceived jinx. His hand instinctively went to his sidearm, a chilling reminder of their inherent violence. Another crew member, a younger, wiry man Carlos knew as Louis, sat huddled, staring blankly, his eyes wide with a silent, profound despair. He was the weakest link, the one most likely to crack. Carlos watched them not just as a captive, but as an analyst. The fear was a potent solvent, dissolving their carefully constructed hierarchy. Trust was eroding faster than the oxygen. This disarray, while terrifying, also presented fleeting windows of opportunity. Rico's aggression, Louis's despair, these were not just reactions, but potential levers. Carlos needed to find the right fulcrum. The armed men were now less a cohesive unit and more a collection of desperate individuals, each fighting their own losing battle against the inevitable. The captain, his face slick with sweat, hammered at a defunct radio, shouting desperate, garbled messages into the static. "Mako 1 to base. We're down. Repeat, we're down." "Come in, damn you," only the hiss of white noise answered, a mocking echo of their isolation. Rico, meanwhile, had resorted to brute force, kicking furiously at a jammed ballast control lever, his grunts of effort mixing with the captain's pleas. It was a futile dance of despair. Carlos watched their increasingly desperate, amateurish attempts. They were out of their depth, literally and figuratively. This wasn't a professional crew. They were thugs thrust into a technical nightmare they couldn't comprehend. He saw them try to activate an emergency buoy, only for it to snag on a corroded line, refusing to deploy. Every failed effort, every broken switch, every unanswered call hammered home the chilling truth: they were utterly alone. No one knew where they were or even that they were missing. The ocean had swallowed them whole, and it wasn't giving them back. The hopelessness settled over the cramped cabin like a shroud, heavier than the stale air. While the cartel members descended into chaos, Carlos's DEA training kicked in, an automatic response to extreme stress. He forced his breathing to slow, conserving precious oxygen, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He subtly assessed the water ingress, tracing the trickle back to a ruptured pipe, not a hull breach. That was critical, repairable. He noted the location of emergency tools, the crude but potentially useful flares, and even the captain's sidearm, now lying forgotten on a control panel. He moved with deliberate calmness, feigning helpfulness but truly observing. He offered quiet, technical advice, keeping his voice level, projecting a professional competence that contrasted sharply with the captain's flailing. "That pipe's shot, Captain. We need to isolate it or we'll be drinking the ocean." He wasn't just trying to survive. He was looking for leverage, for a moment of distraction or vulnerability among the increasingly desperate crew where he could act, either to fix the sub, send a signal, or gain control. Every action, every whispered word was a strategic move in a deadly game of chess. Hours blurred into a suffocating eternity. The air, once merely stale, was now thick and cloying, tasting of metal and fear. Headaches throbbed behind Carlos's eyes, and a strange lethargy settled deep in his bones. He saw it in the others, too. Lewis was openly weeping now, muttering about his mother, seeing things in the shadows. Even Rico, the brute, was quieter, his eyes darting suspiciously, muttering about curses and bad luck. The captain, his face ashen, began arguing with an invisible presence, gesturing wildly at the control panel. Paranoia was setting in, a corrosive acid eating away at what little sanity remained. Carlos found himself struggling to focus, his thoughts drifting, fragments of memories surfacing unbidden. He saw his daughter's face, then the cold, empty eyes of a man he'd put away years ago. Was this the end? Was this how it felt to drown slowly from the inside out? The walls of the submarine seemed to press in, not just physically, but psychologically, turning the cramped space into a tomb of despair. Every breath was a conscious effort, a reminder of the inevitable. The taste of copper filled Carlos's mouth, a metallic tang of desperation. He shook his head, clearing the encroaching haze. He refused to succumb. His mind, despite the oxygen deprivation, began to forge a new path, a desperate, high-stakes gamble. The ruptured pipe, the emergency tools, the captain's forgotten pistol, the despairing crew, all pieces of a grim puzzle. He couldn't fix the sub entirely, not alone, but he could create a crisis, a calculated, controlled breach that might just be their only chance. He eyed the crude, single-use emergency flares meant for surface signaling. If he could ignite one, strategically, perhaps near the damaged pipe, it might create enough localized heat and pressure to cause a small, violent expulsion, a minor explosion that could register as a seismic event on the surface. It was a long shot, a terrifyingly dangerous one, risking a full breach or igniting the fuel, but it was a chance. Or, failing that, he could use the confusion to incapacitate the remaining armed cartel members, take control, and try a more conventional, albeit still suicidal, escape attempt. He knew this plan could cost him his life, but staying put guaranteed it. Carlos took a slow, deliberate breath, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The captain was now huddled, whimpering, while Rico, increasingly agitated, had aimed his pistol at Lewis, accusing him of bad luck. This was it, the moment. With a practiced, fluid motion, Carlos snatched the captain's forgotten pistol from the panel. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged was barely audible over the captain's sobs, but it was deafening to Carlos. "Drop it, Rico," Carlos's voice, though strained, cut through the stale air with an unexpected authority. Rico froze, his eyes widening in disbelief, then rage as he turned to face the new threat. Carlos didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot into the ceiling, the deafening crack echoing in the confined space, a desperate, terrifying signal in the abyss. The recoil jarred his already weakened arm, but the effect was instantaneous. Rico flinched, dropping his weapon. Lewis screamed. The captain stared, mouth agape. Carlos had bought himself a sliver of control, but at what cost? His cover was blown. The real fight for survival and for the mission had just begun. Carlos leveled the pistol, not at the men, but at the control panel. Listen to me, we have one chance. This sub is dying. We need to create a surge, a last gasp, to get a signal out. His voice, though rough from the thin air, commanded attention. With Rico disarmed and the others stunned, he barked orders, pushing past their fear with sheer force of will. He forced Lewis and the remaining crewmen to help him improvise a patch for the worst of the pipe leak, a frantic, clumsy effort in the dim light. Then, with the last emergency flare in hand, he pointed to a corroded exhaust port. This is going to be loud and hot, but it's our only way to send a message to the surface. He jammed the flare into the opening, then, using the pistol's butt, struck the igniter with a decisive blow. A violent hiss, a burst of blinding light, and then a deafening asterisk crump as the flare superheated the trapped exhaust gases, creating a localized, controlled explosion that rattled the sub to its core. The vessel shuddered violently, then with a groan of protesting metal began a slow, agonizing ascent, a single, desperate message sent into the dark, silent ocean. The surface burst into view, a blinding, glorious expanse of blue sky and choppy waves. DEA and Coast Guard vessels swarmed them almost immediately, their sirens a welcome cacophony after the tomb-like silence. Carlos, gasping lungfuls of fresh, salty air, felt his legs buckle as he was hauled onto the deck of a cutter. His body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but his mind, though hazy, registered the success. The surviving cartel members, dazed and disoriented, were quickly secured. Rico, his face a mask of defeat, offered no resistance. Lewis, still muttering, was led away in handcuffs. The captain, collapsed in a heap, was barely conscious. DEA forensics teams immediately boarded the partially submerged makeshift sub, meticulously documenting the cocaine bales and the crude, dangerous engineering. Carlos watched them, the familiar routine of processing evidence a stark contrast to the desperate fight he'd just endured. He was alive, the mission was a success, but the chill of the deep still clung to him, a cold, persistent shadow. Carlos found the world above water to be too vast, too open. Days after the rescue, the hum of fluorescent lights in the debriefing room felt too loud, the walls too far apart. He flinched when the door clicked shut, an involuntary spasm of claustrophobia. The memory of the submarine, a steel tomb pressing in, was a constant, cold presence refusing to recede. Every deep breath he took felt like a conscious fight against stale air, a phantom suffocation. But it wasn't just the physical terror. The moral ambiguity gnawed at him. He had saved the lives of men he was sworn to imprison, men who would undoubtedly return to their criminal ways. He'd seen their fear, their raw humanity, stripped bare by the prospect of death. He'd given them a chance at life, yet his duty was to ensure they faced justice. The lines had blurred in the suffocating darkness, leaving him with a profound unease. He had survived, yes, but a part of him felt irrevocably changed, scarred not just by the fear, but by the uncomfortable truth of shared desperation. Carlos sat by the window in his sparse apartment, staring out at the endless expanse of the ocean. The debriefings were over, the reports filed, the accolades mumbled. On paper, the mission was a resounding success. The Mako cartel's submarine operation crippled, key players in custody, millions in cocaine seized. Justice, in a way, had been served. Yet the victory felt hollow, tinged with a cold dread that refused to dissipate. He had gone to extreme lengths, pushing past every boundary of fear and duty. He reflected on the dark, cramped space, the dwindling oxygen, the desperate faces of men he was sworn to apprehend. He had seen their humanity, however twisted, in their final moments of terror, and in turn, had shared a primal struggle for breath with them. This wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice anymore. It was about navigating a moral abyss, about the raw, desperate fight for life itself. Carlos knew he would continue the fight, his dedication unwavering. But the chilling grasp of the deep and the uncomfortable truth of shared desperation had etched a deeper, more profound cost onto his soul.